Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson. Today we're going to continue our look at the book of Revelation, looking at the first trumpet, the beginning of the execution of God's wrath against those on earth. We're going to talk about the background that connects these first four trumpets to the first four seals that we saw back in Revelation chapter 6. They're connected thematically, and I'll explain how I see these two passages connecting to each other. I'll also talk about how my view of the trumpets fits into my view of the whole book. Thank you for joining me as we examine the treasures in Revelation chapter 8, verse 7.
This is what I will say. I appreciate the depth of the writing of the Revelation, that the echoes of the Old Testament especially, and seeing the context, the full context that's brought to bear. The more I look at Revelation, the more I see these interconnections with Scripture throughout the Scriptures, and the messages are strong. Early on, I said that as we read the instruction from John in his greeting, to keep the words of Revelation, to keep the word of truth and the word of Jesus Christ, that keeping it meant applying it to our lives, to find the principles there that would guide our lives. And that's not how so many eschatological schemes look at Revelation. They're looking for just a timeline of events. They're looking for some kind of map to the future history. But that's really not the heart of Revelation. The heart of Revelation is, what is the truths that we can hold on to, the truths about God, the truths about ourselves and our situation, but understand that there's always hope because God is ultimately in control of history, in control of all the forces that have bearing on our lives. And I'm going to start our time today by looking at a statement. I'm going to give you the conclusion at the beginning, the conclusion to what I believe these first four trumpets are all about. I had thought I would be able to go through all four trumpets today, like I went through all four seals, because there's a lot of similarity in the literary design between the first four seals of the scroll and the first four trumpets of this series. There's so much similarity in design that a lot of people say this is a recapitulation of the same kinds of judgments. Again, I don't think it's a recapitulation. I believe we are moving through a unfolding story, that those first four seals were about preparation and these first four trumpets about the execution of judgment. In fact, all the trumpets about the execution of judgment that were prepared during the seals. But here's my conclusion, and I believe the first four seals and the first four trumpets do have this in common as a message, the theology or thinking behind them. There are supernatural forces guiding natural phenomena that result in God's justice on the wicked. That's, I believe, the message we should take away from the bigger picture. Now, I am going to drill into details for each of the four trumpets. Let me also mention that I said when I gave my outline, the broad outline of the whole book, that I would sound like a preterist while we were talking about chapters 1 through 3. The preterists are those who say that all of Revelation has been fulfilled in history, that the prophecies are all completed and done with. And I do feel like those messages to the churches in chapters 2 and 3 were about their immediate circumstances, and that the promises given to those churches at the time, things like he would cast Jezebel onto a sick bed, or that the church would be vindicated above the synagogue of Satan, that the synagogue of Satan would come and bow to them in a sense, and how that might have been fulfilled. I think that was fulfilled and is done with, because those particular promises were for those particular churches and the living people at the time who received the message from John. Now, I do believe that we can take from the messages principles that we apply to our lives, that are more general than the specific promises that were made at that specific time. But I am more like a preterist when it comes to those particular details of chapters 2 and 3. I think they're pretty much were for those churches at those times, and they're done. The specific details. I said that when we got to this middle section from 4 to 11, that I would sound like the classical amillennialist position or a symbolist position for these chapters. And then when we get to chapters 12 to the end of the book, it's going to sound more like a futurist or one of those who does see certain future history events being described in the book of Revelation. So we're here in the middle section now, and I wanted to share with you a quote from the Revelation commentary called More Than Conquerors by William Hendrickson, which takes that amillennial position, that symbolist position about what's going on. I just want to share his comment. He says, "We cannot escape the impression, therefore, that the symbols refer to a series of happenings, to principles of human and satanic conduct, and of divine moral government. They refer to things that happen again and again and again, so that the book of Revelation is always up to date. The symbols describe principles of conduct and of divine moral government that are in evidence today as well as during the first century AD." That's the general statement for this symbolist position. Everything in Revelation is symbolism, and it symbolizes something that is a principle that recurs in history. Again, I'm going to sound a lot like that right here in the middle section, less like that earlier and less like that later. But in this section, I do think that we have a message that is about human government and spiritual people oppressed by that government. This statement from William Hendrickson is true. The principles apply to today as well as in the first century AD. I think it's for the people in the first century AD. And I think there is actually more Roman context, and that what is being described is about a judgment on Rome as a example of God's judgment in general. But it is about a judgment on Rome. And we looked at how that unfolds with the first 4 seals on the scroll, and how it seemed to me to reflect God's power over Rome in 4 critical areas, with the Parthians always a military threat to the east, with the civil wars at the heart of Rome, really, but threatening also from Gaul, current France, from those Gallic tribes, that was a recent and ever-present in the mind of the Romans threat of civil war to the west. The food supply from Egypt to the south being threatened. That's with the balanced scales and the third horseman. And then just the sort of barbaric chaos that Rome perceived to the north, that death and Hades could come from that direction at any time, because those barbarians were just crazy. That section includes the mention of wild beasts coming and being a part of this death. So we see Rome surrounded on all sides by forces that God controls. God is able to pull out a military leader from Parthia if he so chooses. We see that same kind of action with Israel, and God raised up Nebuchadnezzar against Israel when they were wicked. And so I believe we see this against them. Now the first 4 trumpets, I think, are equally universal in scope. With the pictures of the first 4 seals, we have all 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. There is no direction from which God is not able to judge. The whole world, north, south, east, and west, from wherever you look, God is in control and is universally able to call his forces of judgment against Rome, against anyone. Well, this is not directional, but I think these first 4 trumpets are similarly about God's ultimate control over all the spheres of creation. I don't think the process is chronological. I don't think we're talking about 4 things that happen one after another. I think we're talking about 4 spheres of influence, like north, south, east, and west were for the first 4 seals. I think they are about the spheres of the earth. Even in our modern science books, and this is a picture taken from a website covering modern science principles, we see the earth divided into 4 spheres. The atmosphere all around us. We usually talk about that sphere a lot, atmosphere. But there's also the geosphere, and that's like the rock ground that makes up the earth. The hydrosphere, which are the waters of the earth. That's actually the biggest part of earth, the hydrosphere. And then the biosphere, which is the area where we live. Our cities, our towns, where people populate, where that's the word bio, means life. So it's about where people live. And these are the 4 spheres of earth regularly discussed in science textbooks. Now, the ancient world, for them, the earth was everything. The earth was the cosmos, was the earth and its surroundings. So they saw that as just the complete totality of creation is what we experience around us. And they divided it slightly differently, but curiously, along the same kinds of lines. The basic concept was earth, the ground. That was the one sphere that we share with them, is the idea of the earth. The earth is one sphere of the world, the terra firma earth. Then there was the sea. That was the saltwater sea. The earth and the sea were the 2 main things, but there was also the rivers that were freshwater. In the ancient mind, there was a huge distinction between the freshwater and the saltwater. The saltwater was a power that could destroy. It was associated with the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and of course the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean beyond that. And those were chaos waters. Those would kill you. Drinking salt water doesn't satisfy your thirst, and it doesn't bring life. And being on the ocean is a dangerous, precarious place to be because of storms and large animals like the whales or other large beasts that were in the waters. Those were dangerous, treacherous place to be on the water. But fresh water from springs and the rivers that ran from the mountains, that was life-giving. That was life-preserving. And so the fresh waters were seen as a life-giving image, not like the chaos waters of the ocean that were threatening all the time, but the rivers were refreshing. We see this kind of dynamic even in the creation story in Genesis chapter 2 when it talks about the rivers that flow out of Eden and water the earth. Those river waters were life-giving, but the ocean was always treacherous. And then the last realm were the divine realm, the heavens. Now, in our minds, we clearly distinguish between the atmosphere and the stratosphere or the outer space. We sharply divide, and we don't think about this as one thing. We think about it as quite different, being inside the atmosphere or being in outer space. Those are different, but not so for the ancient world. They did not see that distinction. The sun, the moon, the stars, they were all in the heavens. The clouds were in the heavens. The birds flew in the heavens, but they just saw the heavens. They believed God was beyond what they could perceive of the heavens, and so they would talk about 2 heavens or 3 heavens because they did see levels of heavens, but they were all just the thing above us, beyond what we can, and that was all divine realm. That was the realm of God's control because we could do nothing about it. We can't control the clouds. We can't really control the birds unless they come close to the earth. We can't control the sun, the moon, and stars. All of that's out of our control. And so that's all divine realm, in the control only of the divine. God himself, of course, and his creation, the angels he created. So those are the 4 spheres of creation, and I believe that these 4 first trumpets correspond to them. Chapter 8, verse 7. And the first angel blew the trumpet, and there was hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was thrown to the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. This is, of course, a judgment on terra firma, earth. It throws it to the earth, and that's the key word there. But notice that it is only a third of the earth that is burned up, and a third of the trees. I believe that that is because this is a judgment on Rome, or a symbol of a judgment on a particular historic government, an oppressive government. This is not the final judgment on all creation because it's constrained to a third. In fact, Rome, in rough estimate, could be described as covering a third of the known world at the time. All around the Mediterranean Sea was either Rome or client states of Rome. This is constrained. This is one reason I don't think that this is the final judgment, but a constrained one and a focused partial judgment on earth. Now it does say all the green grass. I once had a preacher who said, and I think more than one has said, all means all, and that's all it means. So you're supposed to understand every time you read all in Scripture that it's the totality of something. At the time, I kind of went along with it. It made sense to me. I can't say that anymore. I think that the word all means what it means in its context. It does not always mean the totality of everything. It means all of a certain type of thing or all within a certain boundary, but it doesn't always mean the totality of creation that it's affecting. And I can prove that with the grass here in Revelation 8:7, because if we look down a little later in Revelation 9:4, at a later trumpet judgment, an angel then is told not to damage the grass of the earth or any green plant or any tree. If there's grass around for the later angel not to touch, then it didn't really get all the grass. Now, what is the trumpet? The trumpet unleashes hail and fire mixed with blood. Each of these trumpets unleash something that is prepared in heaven and then thrown to the earth. That's the key thing of all but one of the trumpets, is that something is thrown to the earth. And this time it's hail and fire mixed with blood. Hail, that's normal to come from the heavens onto the earth. That comes from all the time. Fire, well, they called lightning fire. After all, when lightning touches the earth, it normally causes a fire if it hits something flammable. So hail and fire could be seen as hail and lightning being from the skies. Blood, however, not so much. That is not something that normally comes from heaven. But the thing that struck me as I was reading this and thinking about it was, whose blood? Whose blood is getting mixed with this hail and fire to be thrown in judgment to the earth? Blood is actually a kind of theme we could trace through the book of Revelation. The blood of the Lamb, the blood of the martyrs has been mentioned earlier. If there is a particular reference, probably the blood of the martyrs. I think that this is judgment for their deaths, and so it would make sense that their blood would be accompanying this judgment. The life of something is all connected to breath and blood. In any case, it's a symbol. Whether we are thinking about the blood of the martyrs or not, it's a symbolism, as has been this whole vision. This is a visionary experience. So you see things in a vision that aren't technically possible, right? You see things in a vision that are meaningful but not technically literal. And maybe that's the blood here. The hail and the fire mixed with blood thrown to earth. Now, in Scripture, the hail and fire are most significant echoes of two spaces. One, the first one that would come to my mind is the plague of hail on Egypt. But there was an earlier hailstorm, the first one in Scripture, in Genesis 19, verses 24 and 25. And the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overturned those cities, those in which Lot resided, and all the region about, and all those dwelling in the cities, and all the things springing forth out of the earth. There's a detail that we normally kind of skip because we're focused on the death and destruction of the people in the cities. Reasonable to be focused on that. But it does mention the death or the destruction, the burning up of the plants, the grass and the trees, all the things springing forth out of the earth. So it's a very strong echo of what is being described in Revelation 8 of the hail and fire from heaven, because the rain, the verb for rain here in chapter 19 of Genesis is the normal verb for just ordinary rain. But here it is raining sulfur and fire. And so it's a very close connection. But then there's also the connection in Exodus 9, which is one of the plagues of Egypt. I'll read that, verses 23 through 26. Moses stretched out his staff to the heavens, and Yahweh gave thunder, and hail and fire went to the earth. And Yahweh caused hail to rain on the land of Egypt. And there was hail, and fire was flashing back and forth. Notice that flashing, that is very descriptive of lightning. And so that's why the description of fire and the description of lightning overlap in the Scriptures. The ancients thought of fire, thought of lightning as fire. The fire was flashing back and forth in the midst of the very severe hail, the like of which was not in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. And the hail struck all the land of Egypt, all that was in the field, from human to animal, and the hail struck all the vegetation of the field and smashed every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were, there was no hail. You notice here that it is again restricted. Like only a third of the plants are being destroyed in Revelation 8. Here, only the Egyptian land is being affected by the hail. The land of Goshen, where the Israelites, is accepted. So there is a boundary. Yes, all the vegetation of the field was smashed, but not all of it everywhere, just in Egypt and not even in Goshen, where the Israelites were. This is a second point of destruction, Sodom and Gomorrah, Egypt. And there is one that actually loops in blood in the Old Testament. Our trusty friend Ezekiel, in his vision in Ezekiel 38, verse 22, he's talking about a judgment on Gog and Magog, and we're going to get into Gog and Magog later because it comes up in the book of Revelation explicitly. But in this passage in Ezekiel 38, God says, I will execute justice with him, meaning Gog, with a plague and with blood and torrents of rain and hailstones. Fire and sulfur I will cause to fall on him and on his troops and on many peoples who are with him. So again, this we will get to when we get to Gog and Magog later in the book of Revelation, but it is a third moment in the Old Testament, and I think being anticipated and incorporated into this vision of the first trumpet, blood mixed with rain and hail and fire. And in each case, it is a judgment on a particular place. Sodom and Gomorrah, Egypt, Gog, and Magog, that is being judged. And I think in Revelation, it is Rome. Now, do we have an example of an extraordinary hail plague in Rome? I can't name one specifically. Pompeii could be something like that. And I believe that Revelation is being written after Pompeii, because that happened in the 60s, and I think Revelation was written in the 90s. But even though Pompeii is before John is writing Revelation, I don't count that out as being a possible reference to what we see unfolding in Revelation. Because again, I don't think this is about chronology. It's about the spheres of God's power, about where God's power resides. It resides over the earth, over the heavens, over the seas. It resides throughout all of creation. And so he can execute judgment at any time, in any place. And this is an example in visual symbolism of him doing that on the earth. It's a promise that God will judge Rome and any government that is oppressive, but Rome particularly, since that's the context of the recipients of this message. I think it could be that he has already begun executing his judgment. In the vision of John, it's unfolding somewhat chronologically as the seals occur first and then the trumpets blow later. However, I don't think that it's meant to be understood only as futuristic. I believe it's a message that God is always executing judgment. I don't think, for example, that the hail was the first time. Clearly, we have examples in Sodom and Gomorrah and Egypt, and now I think Ezekiel's vision is still future. For Ezekiel, that I think does play into a future eschatology. However, I think that we are safe to say that God's use of hail as judgment is not something that we have to wait for, because he's done it before. He did it with Sodom, he did it with Egypt, and he's threatening to do it with Rome. I can't point to a specific hailstorm during the time of Rome and say, this is it, this is God doing the first trumpet, per se. I think that would be the wrong way to try to read the book of Revelation, especially this section. I think it's really just an affirmation in the visionary language that God can execute judgment however he wishes, wherever he wishes. He will execute judgment on Rome. As a principle, it does apply to the one moment in time in history and to the end of time. And I think the message there is that the bowl judgments, which I do put into this future ultimate judgment day, the bowl judgments echo many of the elements of these trumpet judgments. That's why people say, well, it's just a recapitulation. It's the same thing over again with the bowls as with the trumpets, because there's so much similarity between them. I think the similarity exists because this is a principle of God's power. Those same four realms, those spheres of control, are the same now and will be when Christ returns, and Christ's power over creation is no different. But I believe here it's the restriction on a third, only a third of the earth. Only a certain section is being judged in the moment. Only a partial judgment. And I think in this case a judgment on Rome, but in principle could be any oppressive government. At the end, when the bowl judgments are poured out, there is no such restriction. None of those are on a third or on a half or on a fourth. Those are all universal. And I believe that's the critical difference between the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments, is that the bowl judgments are the end. There is no further judgment after that, because that's the final judgment on earth. That's the difference between a partial judgment in history in chapters 8 and 9 and a final ultimate judgment that ends history in the latter section of the book.
Thank you for joining me as we examine this first trumpet of the 7 trumpets of Revelation chapters 8 and 9. I always enjoy the time we spend studying together. I look forward to our next opportunity to dive into the treasures of the biblical text.